When I was 11 years old, my life was a lot more bleak than it is now. This happened in the early 2000s. After my dad left my mom and wanted nothing to do with our family, my mom spiraled into alcoholism and spent most of her time at the bottom of a bottle when she wasn't at work. It's a story I'm sure a lot of people can relate to, losing a parent to addiction and depression. We were poor. She could barely afford my school lunch and would shove the whole week's worth in my hands when she got her check to prevent herself from spontaneously blowing it on cigarettes and beer. I had to learn to be more self-sufficient, cooking my own meals and doing my own laundry. A lot of the times that included taking myself home after school. It was Mom's responsibility to pick me up from school since a school bus didn't go to our district of the city. Usually she did, concerningly either a little tipsy or with a pounding hangover, but sometimes she would be too deep in a drunken stupor or dead asleep after a long day at the club partying like the 20-something she wasn't. Whenever this happened, I took the public bus home to our little inner-city apartment. This was another one of those days. I was standing outside the school building at the end of the day and watching the students pile into the bright yellow buses or their parents' cars before being driven away. Eventually, the teachers left too, except for Mrs. Hartman, my sweet Spanish teacher who I could tell was absolutely sick of my mother forgetting me. I still remember the gray, overcast sky which reflected my mood at the time. "I'm just gonna take the bus," I finally told her with a sigh. "Well, if you don't mind me taking a few stops on the way there to pick up my kids from daycare and finish some errands, I can take you home, Liv." Mrs. Hartman smiled at me. "We don't mind, right, Sydney?" I glanced over at her daughter who was my age, and she shot me a mean side eye before continuing to play her Nintendo DS while sitting in the shade. Sydney was Mrs. Hartman's bratty daughter who didn't like me for some stupid reason. Mrs. Hartman was a lovely woman but also a bit naive and ditzy, so she didn't quite realize that her kid was one of the mean popular girls in class that made fun of shy, timid kids like me. Sydney made fun of me for being poor and wearing the same clothes often, and she absolutely hated having to linger after class because her mom wanted to stay and make sure I was okay. Being stuck in a car with her was out of the question. I already had to look forward to teasing tomorrow because of Mom forgetting to pick me up again. "No, thank you," I politely told Mrs. Hartman. "I'm used to it." "Oh, but it's going to rain really hard soon. Where's your umbrella?" Mrs. Hartman asked. Can she afford one? Sydney mumbled something to that effect under her breath, low enough for her mom not to hear. "I'll be fine." I didn't look back as I started to walk away from school property. I would in fact not be fine, because not only did I not have an umbrella, but I didn't even have a jacket. I didn't know just how hard it would rain. Everyone else's parents watched the morning news and made sure their kids had raincoats or umbrellas just in case. Not my mom. That's just another thing I had to do on my own, I guess. Watch the forecast myself. I needed to take 2 buses to get home. During the first long bus ride, it began to rain profusely. I got off at the usual dilapidated-looking stop that didn't even have a shelter or a bench. Just a sign, on a street that hardly ever seemed to have traffic or any pedestrians. I tried to go into a nearby convenience store to take refuge from the rain, but when I came back out, I had missed my bus and knew it wouldn't come for another hour. Frustrated, I decided to try and walk the rest of the way home, based on the foggy memory of the appearance of the streets between my home and my school during car rides with my mom and city bus rides. This only lasted for 20 minutes before I had to try and take shelter again. The rain came down even harder, and I remember the already few people on the street were running indoors. I was starting to become nervous because I wasn't entirely sure where I was going. I turned a corner and expected to see a familiar street, but I couldn't tell if I'd seen it before or not. Uncertainly, I speed walked down the sidewalk, thinking maybe the next street would be familiar. This one seemed to be lined with abandoned, empty stores, or very niche, tiny mom and pop shops that looked like they didn't get many customers. The rain was absolutely pouring now, creating streams on the road, the sewer grates only able to drain so much of the water. That's when I saw it, the doll shop which had a name long forgotten by me. All I cared about at the time was that it was the only building on the block which had an awning. Feeling like I was at a water park, I ducked under the little green roof jutting out over the single glass door. I didn't look at the shop at first, I simply shivered, looking like a miserable wet cat and staring at the sheets of rain, streaking down and creating a cold mist. Absolutely no one was around. I could distantly hear traffic and busier streets, but this part of the city felt totally dead. The wind blew, making everything even worse, so the raindrops fell at a slanted angle and pelted me like bullets even under the awning. I know it sounds like I'm being dramatic, but at that rate I was going to have a horrible cold. I turned and noticed the old-looking open sign on the door and quickly pushed it open. Water dripped from me and I left wet footprints everywhere like I'd just been swimming. It was dusty inside, not to mention dark, with only a small table lamp on the counter and a standing lamp in another corner. It did not look like a very modern store, not even for the early 2000s. The walls and floor were dark brown wood, the floorboards creaked with every step, and cobwebs were in the ceiling corners. However, the weirdest thing about it was the wares. Dolls, all creepy but beautiful, lined the shelves and sat on displays. Porcelain dolls, rag dolls, wooden dolls, ball-jointed dolls, cloth dolls. Nothing modern like Barbie or Bratz, the type of toys you'd see at your grandparents' house. There was also the occasional stuffed animal, designed like they were from the 80s with big dopey smiles and large eyes. Some people would find this creepy, but as a sheltered child who didn't watch horror movies and didn't have many toys, I thought it was cool. The next thing I noticed was how quiet and empty the place was. It was pretty small, just having a singular room, with a hallway by the counter which was covered with drapes and thus made me think it was off limits to customers. No one was behind the desk, but there was a card sign that had "out to lunch" written on it in ink, next to a little service bell. "Hello?" I called, thinking an employee was in a break room somewhere and wanting to make my presence known. Maybe I could get directions. No one answered. The emptiness and the shadows pooling in the dim corners swallowed my voice. It felt lonely in there. It made me feel more sad than scared. Sad for the poor owners who clearly didn't make much of a profit from their little business. I thought as much because of how outdated and slightly dirty everything looked. I glanced back at this single shop front window to the left of the door, seeing that it was still raining cats and dogs. I did not want to go back out there. The shop was peaceful compared to the weather, so I decided to wait out the rain. In the meantime, I browsed their selection of toys. The dolls, with their glass eyes and pretty painted faces, stared out into space. Some of them had pretty Victorian-era dresses, but I remember my favorite one was the clown doll. I know you might think that sounds crazy, but at the time it wasn't scary. It was a ball-jointed doll made to look like a little girl dressed as a clown. Her head the size of a basketball and her height ending just above my knee. She had orange curly hair and pigtails and a sad-looking but beautiful face painted with clown makeup. She wore a onesie with 3 buttons, the top one in the shape of a star. the middle in the shape of a heart and the last in a normal circular shape. Her outfit was yellow with thin red stripes and the buttons were blue. She had big, wet-looking glass eyes and a small pink mouth made to look like a sad pout. I thought she looked cute and wished I had the money to buy her. Time ticked away and I felt more uncomfortable with being there, since the clerk hadn't returned from lunch yet, making me wonder if the sign was actually meant to say open at all. But if it was closed, it would surely be locked, right? I desperately wanted to sit down. I was soaking wet and tired, so I went over to a display in the corner by the entrance where a doll that looked like a medieval queen wearing a long dress was sitting. I removed the doll gently and set her against the wall, under the window, and sat in the rocking chair she had been perched in. I was kind of afraid I'd get in trouble if the clerk returned, so I made up a lie in my head that I found it this way in case they did come back. A clerk never showed up and I was getting antsy. Was my mom looking for me? How long was it going to rain like this? Would I be able to find my way home if Mom wasn't looking for me? Would I get into deep trouble for choosing to walk the rest of the way instead of simply waiting an hour for my bus? Maybe I should go back and wait for the next one. After all, it wasn't too late to fix my mistake. But first, I wanted to use the bathroom, so I stood up from the rocking chair and dropped my backpack on the floor. That's when I heard it. I heard what sounded like little footsteps padding over the floor somewhere in the furthest aisle. In shock, I recoiled and stepped on the doll I'd taken off the chair. I fell on top of it and it broke, a crack going through its otherwise perfect face. "Oh no!" I gasped and kneeled down to inspect it. I was absolutely horrified. The doll looked expensive and there was no way my mother would be able to pay for it. Thinking fast, I picked it up and hid it behind a big dollhouse in that corner. Then I investigated the noise I heard earlier. I peered around the aisle cautiously, seeing just more shelves with dolls displayed on them. Nothing. A cat darted from the bottom shelf past my feet and through another shelf, knocking toys aside all the while. I yelped and recoiled in shock before calming down and hunting down the cat. It was an orange tabby with bright green eyes, and it was now lounging on the desk with its tail flicking irritably as it made eye contact with me. Its collar said Howie, and I figured he was the pet of the owners and must have been the source of the sound, although I could have sworn those small footsteps sounded like the hard clicking of little-heeled shoes. Satisfied with my finding, I went down that curtained-off hallway in search of the restroom. It was the first door to the left, with there being an exit at the end of the hall and 2 other doors. I went in and there was a single toilet with no stalls as expected. I did my business and washed my hands before I heard a big thunderclap from outside that startled me. I didn't even realize it was thundering before, so to say my heart was pounding was an understatement. This is where things get a little strange. The single light fixture in the bathroom flickered just as it did this, and I felt a chill sweep down my back, raising goosebumps in its path. Everything felt just off and my stomach felt queasy. I hurried out of the bathroom and back into the store, and the first thing I realized was how much darker it looked. There was no more natural light coming in because the window and door were gone, replaced with a yellowish wall covered in old-fashioned flowery wallpaper. The second thing I noticed was the feeling of being watched, like every toy in that room was alive and aware of my presence. When my eyes landed on that clown girl doll again, I could have sworn her eyes had shifted since I've been in the bathroom. Before she was looking straight ahead, standing in front of a wooden case, and now her eyes were turned to the left with her head cocked just a bit, as if she was looking at me. I stood there for a few good seconds, the cogs in my brain slowly turning to process the fact that In the 5 or 6 minutes it took to use the bathroom, the door and window had disappeared like it had never been there to begin with. I walked over and slid my hands all over the wall, thinking someone was playing a prank on me and had put wallpaper over the door and window. But no, it was a solid wall. I knocked it and it felt sturdy under my knuckles. I tried to get my breathing under control as I turned back around to face the room. Before I could make another move, I froze like a deer in headlights. Something had changed. Something was different about the room now. I could feel it in my bones, but it was so cluttered with toys that I couldn't put my finger on it right away. Then I realized at least 3 toys were missing. 1, and the clown girl. 2, a toy I hadn't brought up before made to look like a small boy wearing a lion onesie, complete with whiskers drawn on his plump cheeks and an animal hoodie with a mane framing his head. 3, a wind-up infant on all fours that was clearly able to crawl if you twisted the little lever on its back. They were all a few of the toys I'd admired the longest when I first entered, before I got tired enough to sit down. And in their place was a circle of clean wood on an otherwise dust-layered floor. At this point I was terrified, and I yearned for an adult. Howie watched me from the desk still, but his presence wasn't comforting. I felt like he knew what would happen to me, strangely enough. Still thinking an employee was taking a lunch break somewhere, I fled back into that hall to check the other rooms. Instead, when I laid eyes on the exit sign above the door at the end, I changed plans and went straight for that, having forgotten there was another way out. I went through the exit, and instead of being met with cold air and rain, I entered an exact copy of the shop, missing toys and all, everything exactly in place. I turned around to go back through, but the exit door was gone, and it was just that wall where the door used to be. It was like I had teleported back to where I was. This time, when I ran back into the hall, I continued with my plan of checking the other doors. One on the right was a closet space with cleaning supplies in it, and a big spider had its home in there. I went to the last door and opened it, desperately asking, "Is anyone in here?" Yes, there was. The room was a small office with a man hunched over in a rickety chair at his desk full of papers. But the man was not alive. He was a dried-up, almost mummified-looking corpse wearing a button-up shirt and trousers. Only a few wiry strands of hair hung from his gray head, and his body looked emaciated from decay. He didn't smell like anything but dust and mothballs. There was no odor of rot in the air at all. At the sight of his hollow eye sockets and slightly agape mouth, I inhaled a sharp breath and took a step back. Did he just die sitting there, slightly leaned back like he was staring at the ceiling with one arm laid out over the desk? How did he die with no one realizing? How long had he been dead? How did his cat survive for so long? Was this place haunted because of him, and that's why those toys disappeared? All these questions circled through my mind, but above all, I wondered, will I be stuck here forever? A giggle sliced through the silence, and I looked down the hall to see all the dolls that had disappeared, peeking their small pale faces around the corner at me from the storeroom. Their big, realistic eyes stared at me unblinkingly, and I felt sheer horror course through my veins. I screamed and ran for the exit again, and the same thing as before happened, but instead of it being an exact copy of the room, there were some changes. Sure, it was the same shop room, but now the dolls looked decades older than they already did, covered in webs, dust, dirt, and riddled with cracks and holes, like they'd been through the ringer. Instead of standing or sitting in the poses they'd been positioned in, they were lying on their sides and scattered about like someone had knocked them down and pushed them over. Not only that, but some of them were hanging from the ceiling by nooses, or had knives stuck in their empty sockets. I breathed heavily as they looked around in total fear, wondering what forces were at play here. The cat, Howie, was now sitting patiently on the desk, still staring at me and utterly unconcerned with the madness happening around us. On the other side of the drapes hanging in front of the hall's entryway, I could see 2 red clown shoes sticking out from under the fabric. The clown doll was standing there. I mustered enough courage to run past there anyways, hoping I'd knock her over, but it turned out to be a trick. The doll had removed its shoes and planted them there to fool me, and just after I tripped over them, I heard another mischievous giggle and looked up to see the doll peeking around the open doorway of the office. Crying now, I bolted through the exit door, praying it would actually lead me outside this time. But no such luck. This time the shelves were all knocked over and things were in a bigger state of disarray than before, like a tornado had gone through there. The most frightening thing of all, however, was that the toddler dressed as the lion doll, the clown doll, and the baby doll were positioned in a row in the center of the floor, staring at me. In front of them was the broken doll of the medieval queen with her poofy dress and crown, her face cracked and her piercing brown eyes glaring at me. "I'm sorry," I begged. "I didn't mean to break her." Howie the cat hissed, and the sound startled me so terribly that I broke into a run, skirting around the dolls and going into the hall. I cast a glance over my shoulder and saw that their heads had spun 180 degrees to watch me flee. When I turned my head forward, I screamed bloody murder, as the corpse of what I had assumed was the owner or manager was now in the center of the hallway, still leaned back in his chair with his arm dangling stiffly. More high-pitched childish laughter behind me. I looked and the dolls froze as soon as my eyes landed on them, in the middle of crawling under the curtain after me. The baby, eyes missing, paused mid-crawl. The lion paused one step in the air, and the clown doll paused while skittering across the right wall like a spider. I turned back towards the corpse of the man when I heard the scrape of a chair leg against the hard floor. My heart was seized in an ice-cold grip of terror, as what I was so sure had been a corpse was now standing rigidly in front of me, inches away. His hand was held out, palm up. "Pay your dues." His quiet sandpaper voice whistled out of his frozen, shriveled mouth like a ventriloquist puppet. I pushed past him, screaming and fleeing through the exit again, only to find the same room in an even worse state of disrepair. The walls were crumbling, full of cracks and holes, and through each opening a hellish choir of tormented moans and weeping spilled out like the tortured cries of the damned. There were holes in the floor which were deeper than they had any right being, and decapitated dolls' heads and popped-out eyes rolled over the floor as if pushed by an invisible wind. The dolls from before were the only toys still intact, paused mid-chase as if in a game of freeze tag, knives taken from God knows where clutched in their porcelain grip, and their eyes hungrily staring at me. The queen doll watched from the entryway of the hall, peering through the gap in the curtain. Every time I looked away, they got a few inches closer, and Howie the cat was now yowling at me like I was a threat, his back arched and his hair standing on end. I was now in the throes of panic, but I still forced my body to move as I did the only thing that I could think of. I snatched up my backpack from the corner with the rocking chair. When I looked back, hearing the scuttling noises, the evil dolls were closer now. The clown doll's face still looked pouty and pitiful, making her murderous intent all the creepier. I tried to keep my eyes on them as I rummaged through my backpack, but there was so much stuff tossed in there completely unorganized that I got impatient and needed to look. I finally fished my coin purse out, but when I looked back, the clown doll's sad eyes were inches from me, with her knife raised towards my head. I tried to knock them all over as I ran past them, but they were as heavy as real children, and their bodies now felt like flesh and bone rather than fragile porcelain. I slammed my lunch money, the only thing my mother could ever afford me, on the desk. "Here's your money," I yelled out. "I don't know if it's enough, but it's all I have." Then I ran through the hall, sidestepped the queen doll so I didn't damage her further, and hurtled through the exit door. I ended up back in the hallway in front of the same exit door I just entered. But things were different this time. That oppressive atmosphere was gone. I ran down the hall, my backpack thumping on my back, past the office door which I refused to even glance at, and into the front room, which was filled with grayish, dim sunlight from an overcast afternoon sky. I looked to my right towards the desk. The cat was still there, licking his paw casually and unbothered by my being there, and next to him was a piece of paper which wasn't there before. I took it curiously and realized it was a receipt. The doll I broke had actually been cheaper than I initially thought, and cost a week's worth of lunch money. I took the receipt with me and went out the front door into the pouring rain, using my backpack, still heavy with my stuff, as a shield to protect my head from the downpour. I looked back only once as I walked down the street, catching a glimpse of the clown doll looking at me with her hands and nose pressed against the window. I returned to the bus stop and waited. When I got on the bus, I removed my backpack from above my head, and finally realized it seemed a lot heavier than usual. I sat down in the back of the bus and zipped it open, coming face to face with the cracked medieval queen doll which had been stuffed in there. She appeared lifeless, but regardless, I left her in the seat before exiting the bus at the street my apartment was on. The nightmare was over, and thankfully the doll didn't follow me around like in the movies. And no, Mom did not realize I was gone for that long. She was still knocked out on the couch surrounded by beer bottles and cigarettes when I'd used the key inside the flower pot to let myself in. I never told anyone what happened until now. They'd just call me a liar and I didn't want to get in trouble. I don't know who that corpse was or why all that happened, but when Mom was taking me with her on errands one day, we drove through that street where the doll shop was located. I would recognize that rundown street anywhere now, so I watched out the window wanting to see if I could spot any sign of activity in it. The doll shop simply wasn't there. In its place was a big, dark, empty alleyway between the two buildings it had been standing next to. My mom could never afford them anyway, but I didn't like dolls much after that.